Understanding and Responding to Climate Skepticism. In this final lecture, I will discuss why people choose to be climate skeptics and what can be done to change their mind. But before I get to all that, I want to talk about the Strawman Fallacy. It's going to become clear why in a minute. The Strawman Fallacy is a characteristic error in reasoning. It is committed when someone criticizes a less plausible version of an argument or view than what was intended. Here's a blatant example of the Strawman Fallacy. Suppose that Sally says, we should relax the laws regulating cannabis use. And imagine that Joe retorts, no, because if people get unrestricted access to all intoxicants and drugs, they will lose their work ethic and will become reckless thrill seekers. Productivity will fall dramatically and crime rate will go up. In this example, Joe commits the Strawman fallacy because the view he attributes to Sally is significantly less plausible than the view Sally intended to state. After all, the view Sally actually articulated was a modest one. We should relax the laws regulating cannabis use. But that's not the view Joe attributed to Sally. The view Joe attributed to Sally is much less plausible. We should give people unrestricted access to everything. On this view, Sally would be claiming that a 9-year-old should be able to buy fentanyl. So Joe is criticizing a strawman's view, not a view the actual Sally holds. And I hope you can see why this is called a fallacy. It's a fallacy because Joe's criticism misses its target. Instead of engaging his interlocutor, he is engaging someone inside his own head. The Strawman fallacy can be committed in 3 different ways. First would be taking words out of context. Here's an example. Suppose that Sally tells Joe, I love you as a friend, but I can't see us together as a couple. Here Joe lashes back. You say that you love me, but you don't want to sleep with me. You're a liar. Here Joe is ignoring the context of the phrase I love you and interpreting it to mean romantic love, although it is clear that Sally meant it as a friendship. What Joe is doing here is a strawman because he is engaging someone in his imagination, not what Sally is actually saying. Another way in which the Strawman fallacy is committed involves criticizing an obsolete, incomplete, or dumbed-down version of a view as opposed to an up-to-date, complete, and intelligent version. Here's an example committed by the famous French dictator Napoleon Bonaparte. When he was told about steam-powered navigation, which was back then a brand new invention, Napoleon replied, You would make a ship sail against the winds and currents by lighting a bonfire under her deck? I have no time for such nonsense. Here Napoleon is committing the Strawman fallacy because instead of talking about how steam-powered ships actually work, he describes the idea as lighting a bonfire under the deck. Of course, when put that way, steam power sounds ridiculous. But in reality, it is not ridiculous because the fire is contained in a boiler vessel which transforms the heat into mechanical energy. By ignoring all that and dismissing the dumbed-down characterization, Napoleon made a big mistake, which might have cost him the opportunity of world domination. Finally, there is the most common version of strawman, treating an extreme case as if it is representative. A great example of this can be found in Michael Moore's 2002 documentary Bowling for Columbine. Michael Moore, as you might know, is a filmmaker with a liberal leaning. In this documentary, Moore offers a criticism of the Second Amendment and its proponents. Now I will show you an excerpt from this documentary in which Moore interviews one such person. The first couple of questions are about the Oklahoma City bombing, which you can find more information through a link in the video description if you are curious. But the rest of the interview should be pretty easy to follow. Let's hear them out.
Do you believe it was right to blow up the building in Oklahoma City? I'm not saying they did it. I'm just saying, was it right?
Why was it blown up? That's a good question. Why was that building blown up? And who blew it up?
But if someone did it, it would be wrong.
Yeah.
It is wrong to take the lives of those people.
Yeah. I use the pen because the pen is mightier than the sword. But you always must keep a sword handy for when the pen fails. I sleep with a .44 Magnum under my pillow.
Come on. That's what everyone says. Is that true?
It's true.
If we were to go and
the whole world knows that.
If we were to go and look under your pillow right now, would we see a .44 Magnum?
Yeah.
Honestly?
Mm-hmm.
Would you take us and show us right now?
He took me into his bedroom, but told the cameraman to stay out. Sure enough, there was a .44 Magnum under his pillow.
There it is, okay. Is it loaded?
Ay, ay, ay.
Okay, I believe you. Don't do that. No, don't do that. Don't put the gun to your head. Jeez.
I'm not gonna get hurt.
This thing is loaded.
It's loaded, it's safe. You've got to pull the trigger, pull the hammer, and shoot it.
Put the hammer back.
No one has a right to tell me that I can't have it. That is protected under our Constitution.
Where does it say a handgun is protected?
No, gun. We should, every
citizen... It doesn't say gun. It says arms.
What is arms?
It could be a nuclear weapon.
That's right. It could be a nuclear weapon.
Do you think you should have the right to have weapons-grade plutonium here on the farm?
We should be able to have anything.
Should you have weapons-grade plutonium?
I don't want it.
But should you have the right to have it if you did want it?
That should be restricted.
Oh, so you do believe in some restrictions?
Well, there's wackos out there.
When we encounter a viewpoint we don't share, may it be about how to load the dishwasher or solve environmental problems, we should refrain from committing the Strawman fallacy. Intellectual charity is the preventive remedy against strawman. If an opinion you have heard sounds stupid, if an argument you have read looks like it was written by an idiot, ask yourself the following question. Could I be seeing just a strawman? Could there be a more plausible version of this view? What I'm describing here is called the principle of charity, a name coined by famous American philosopher Donald Davidson. Here is the principle. When you disagree with someone, always try to interpret what they say in a way that will maximize its plausibility. This principle might strike you as silly. After all, if you follow the principle of charity, you would argue in a way that is not very popular. In the United States, for instance, people argue to win at any cost. If you win by associating your interlocutor with extremism, then great, people think at least. But always arguing to win is actually terrible. It prevents us from sharing and comparing our perspectives honestly and combining our brain power together to tackle complex problems we can't solve alone. And environmental problems are complex problems. If we aren't vigilant against the strawman when we argue about them, we have no way of solving any of them. I'm saying all of this because today, there's a tendency among environmentalists to pigeonhole every climate skeptic as an extremely ignorant loudmouth who cannot distinguish the weather from the climate. But not every climate skeptic is the same. Climate skepticism is a spectrum. It's a matter of degree. There are definitely some skeptics who espouse more extreme views, some skeptics who espouse less extreme views. Our goal moving forward is going to be understanding and analyzing different views falling on this spectrum. Let's start with the extreme end among climate skeptics. Those who claim that climate change is a hoax or a conspiracy, such as Oklahoma Senator James Inhofe here. Let's watch a short clip taken from a speech Senator Inhofe gave on the U.S. Senate floor in 2015.
Of national attention, and in case we have forgotten, because we keep hearing that 2014 has been the warmest year on record, I asked the chair, you know what this is? It's a snowball. And that's just from outside here. So it's very, very cold out, very unseasonal. So here, Mr. President, catch this.
A slightly less extreme version of climate skepticism is the claim that climate change is real, but it is not caused by humans. This is the view that was held by President Trump during his presidency. He said in an interview, "I think something is happening, something is changing, and it'll change back again. I don't think it's a hoax. I think there's probably a difference, but I don't know that it is man-made." Yet a slightly less extreme but still quite extreme one is the claim that climate change is real and is caused by humans, but requires no significant action. An example of such an extreme skeptic is the conservative pundit Ben Shapiro, who once shared this nugget of wisdom. Suppose that the predictions about sea level rise turn out true. The levels rise by 5 or even 10 feet. The coastal areas get flooded. Don't you think the people who live in those areas won't sell their homes and just move? And finally, we get to the least extreme version of climate skepticism. Climate change is real and is caused by humans, but the commonly advertised remedies won't be effective or sufficient. That's, of course, the thesis defended by Michael Shellenberger in his book Apocalypse Never. According to Shellenberger, renewables won't save us from climate change. If we want to beat climate change, we need to make an accelerated and decisive investment in nuclear energy. But by that standard, even Bill Gates is a climate skeptic because most of his book is dedicated to explaining why supposedly magic solutions like Elon Musk's idea of converting 10% of Arizona with solar panels won't work. Gates thinks that, contrary to the conventional wisdom among environmentalists, renewables won't save us. We need to develop and deploy new technologies. You might have a very negative opinion of people like Inhofe, Trump, and Shapiro. But it is important not to equate all climate skeptics. They don't speak for everyone. Indeed, people end up being climate skeptics in differing degrees and for different reasons. Not taking that into account and thinking that they are all drooling morons with snowballs in their hands would be committing the Strawman Fallacy. But then again, there is a temptation to pigeonhole. The people who are near the extreme end are conservative politicians such as Inhofe, Trump, and Shapiro. They don't seem to care much for the environment, or if they do care about it, they are having a tough time showing that they care, at least on camera. And on the less extreme end, there are people like Shellenberger and Gates who have decidedly liberal politics. Furthermore, Shellenberger has convincing environmentalist credentials. He spent decades working for environmental causes. Bill Gates, too, puts his money where his mouth is. He invested tens of billions of dollars of his wealth into fighting climate change, though he could have done what Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos have done so far and played Rocket Man with his wealth. So does that explain why people become climate skeptics and how extreme they become? Perhaps conservatives don't care about the planet and dismiss climate change altogether, but liberals and environmentalists have a tendency to stay less extreme. There's something missing in this analysis. Everyone whose views we looked at so far are, in some way, exceptional. They are politicians, influential political commentators, or world-famous billionaires. It is easy enough to understand why this or that politician, political commentator, or billionaire would become or pretend to be a climate skeptic, and how far they would go. What is more interesting and consequential is ordinary people. What kinds of climate skepticism do we encounter among ordinary people? Are they more or less extreme? What are their reasons? Sociologists Kristen Haltiner and Dilshani Sarachandara studied precisely these questions. They found that People who are skeptical about human-caused climate change most often hold pro-environmental views. They demonstrate support for political measures to curb pollution, investments in renewable energy, reforestation, and preservation of the earth. Many of the initiatives that seem to be gaining support among skeptics are likely to improve air quality in the short term and reduce levels of greenhouse gas emissions in the long term. Understanding and better communicating these nuances among skeptical views is particularly important where politicians and political pundits often tend to reject pro-environmental policies in the guise of widespread climate skepticism. In other words, the most vocal and powerful extreme climate skeptics do not represent the views of ordinary climate skeptics. Focusing on people like these is a mistake. If we think climate skepticism is a problem, we need to make an effort to understand and respond to the ordinary folks. And while doing that, we should avoid the Strawman fallacy and observe the principle of charity. Climate skepticism in its most extreme forms is popular in the United States, where almost 40% of the population doesn't think that climate change poses a significant threat. This is still a minority, but it's a large minority. And it's much larger as a minority than those we encounter in other Western nations. One common reason people offer as justification for climate skepticism is distrust in governments and institutions. This shouldn't come as a surprise. The average American sees the government as corrupt and inefficient. U.S. Congress, for example, has an approval rating of 16% as of recording this. Within this context, it's no wonder why most people take the data and forecast the U.S. government puts forward or funds as unreliable. Another common reason people offer to explain why they are skeptical is what they perceive as environmental alarmism and failed predictions of nearing catastrophe. Remember, for instance, Al Gore predicting that sea levels may rise 20 feet in the near future, and Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez warning that the world will end in 12 years if we don't act against climate change. Many people hear these ridiculous predictions and stop listening to any warning. But even the scientific community is not blameless. I'm old enough to remember the 1980s when respectable scientists would regularly appear on TV and predict that the destruction of the ozone layer will cause acid rains to pour down and destroy all marine and forest life on the planet. Many people who took those predictions seriously back then felt deceived when the ozone layer proved more resilient than expected and humanity was much faster at phasing out the chemicals that damaged it. Understandably, experiences like that make them skeptical of the current warnings about climate change, even the more reasonable and well-supported ones. But even those who believe the current warnings feel a palpable degree of fatigue. Fear is a great motivator in the short term, but fear, especially intense and sustained fear, leads to resignation after a while. And here, opportunistic producers of the kind of media psychologist Kyle Killian calls disaster porn might be partly to blame. May it be fictional like the over-the-top blockbuster The Day After Tomorrow, or overtly political like Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth, or beautifully made and narrated like Anthropocene. The long-term effect is almost universal. People come away with the impression that climate change and other large-scale environmental problems are not things we can act against, prepare for, or mitigate. They are unstoppable events that will result from the irredeemably corrupt human nature. Take the last one, Anthropocene. You have all seen it, or at least I hope that you have all seen it. Did you feel hope? Did it feel like there is a single thing anyone can do to stop what's going on? At the end, I personally felt like opening a bottle of whiskey and keep drinking until I cannot think anymore. Many less extreme climate skeptics who disagree with the commonly proposed solutions to climate change are suffering from the same fatigue. But unlike Schellenberger and Gates, they give up and stop trying. But my goal in this lecture is more than just helping you understand the mind of a climate skeptic. I also want to help you learn how to engage climate skeptics in a productive way. This much should be clear by now. Accusing a skeptic of ignorance, stupidity, or evil is a failure of charity and an example of the Strawman Fallacy. So avoid such accusations if you can, even if you believe they are true. Instead, try to understand and be responsive to these common reasons for climate skepticism. But how do we be responsive to them? Especially the first one appears insurmountable. But it really is not. Our governments and political institutions can be reformed. But it will take effort from us, citizens. We should write to our representatives and urge them to look at the data carefully about what works and what doesn't. We should be active in our city councils and town hall meetings where important decisions are being made that can increase or decrease the resiliency of our homes, businesses, and public spaces against a changing climate. We should, if possible, run for office. We should also demand more transparency and accountability from our government. We should stay informed and inform others about how public funds are being used. We should use our constitutional right to peaceful protest when we see corruption or lack of effective leadership. But most importantly, restoring our collective faith in the system will require us to talk to each other. We shouldn't give in to partisanship and other forms of divisive politics. We can also fight the deleterious effects of alarmism. First and foremost, we can act responsibly and refrain from making or repeating alarmist statements. We can also continuously educate ourselves and those around us about scientific uncertainty and quality of evidence. I don't want this to come across as condescension. After all, I myself learned a ton in the process of researching for this course and teaching it several times in the last 2 years. Indeed, continued research meant that 10 lectures had to be overhauled just this semester. That's the only way I know for staying vigilant against alarmism. But just education isn't enough. When we hear catastrophic predictions, we must verify the relevant facts. We must call out people who make such predictions if the facts don't line up. I know that many of you are sweet, non-confrontational people. But here, the moral obligation to say something is too great, and the consequences of remaining silent are too grim. Finally, disaster fatigue, perhaps the hardest one to beat. What can we do about it? To ward off fatigue, it's important to keep an informed historical perspective on current events. Remember and remind others how resourceful humanity has been. Thanks to that resourcefulness, technological and scientific progress is on an exponential curve. And we have survived worse before. Genetic evidence indicates that somewhere during the last major ice age, human population declined to only about 1,000 or so individuals. But our ancestors found a way to survive, even with nothing but the most basic stone tools. Today, we have the power of the atom in our hands. We have modern science. We have powerful computers. We have endless factories. And most important, our history bears witness. We will find a way. And that perspective should help us inspire optimism and courage rather than sulking in pessimism or being paralyzed by fear. But of course, these are mostly my opinions or things I got from the emerging literature of political psychology of environmentalism. As always, I'm more interested in hearing what you think. This brings me to the end of this final lecture. Teaching this course has been both a challenge and a pleasure for me, but I'm happy that it happened, and I'm glad you came along because I learned a lot from you on the way. I hope it wasn't a waste of time on your end. Send me a message if you have any questions, and thank you for your remarkable patience. Farewell.